Hi, I'm here filming in my office. No, wait. Let's go to New York. Oh, let's go to France. What about a spaceship? Wow. If you think I'm in all those locations, call yourselves Penn and Teller because you've just been fooled. That's right, I'm here in front of a green screen. Whoa. So what is a green screen? A green screen gives you the ability to remove your subject from the background and put them anywhere else. So how do you use a green screen? Well, the first thing you need to do is, if you're using a cloth green screen, is to get 2 light stands and a bar to be able to go from the top to clamp the green screen to. You want to try to use stronger clamps so that way you can pull the green screen and stretch it out as much as possible. Because in order to get a clean key, which is to be able to remove the green as easily as possible in post-production, is that you need to have as minimal shadows as possible. So we want to pull that out as best as possible. Now, if we are using a cloth green screen, something you can do is you can iron it, you can use a steamer, or something I use a lot of times. I'll take a spray bottle, fill it with water, and spray the green screen. Now, that process does take a little bit longer, so you need to let it dry. But if you're planning on shooting the next day and you don't want to stand there steaming the thing, that works perfectly fine. Now, what size of green screen should you get? So, a lot of people say the whole saying, size doesn't matter. Well, with green screens, it does to an extent. What do I mean? Well, so if your green screen is too small, then your subject can't reach their arms that wide because they're going to be leaving the green screen. And then at that point, you won't be able to key it out. You'll have to then mask around your subject, which is something you can easily do. A lot of Hollywood movies do it, but it's a more time-consuming process. And if we want to avoid that, it's better to either get a bigger green screen or to make sure your subject understands how far they're able to go. So the green screen behind me, I've had for probably 12 years. It's a 10 by 20 green screen. I have no idea what brand it is. I do not remember. I know I got it on Amazon years ago. And so the ability to either stretch it out long ways or you can stretch it out vertically so that way you can have the subject standing on the green screen. Now, something if you do have your subject standing on cloth is you're going to get a lot more bunches up of cloth, and that's going to be harder to key, especially out their feet. So something you can do is you can really pull out the green screen and tape it down to try to minimize that as best as possible. So once we have our green screen set up, the next thing we want to do is we want to make sure our lighting is as even as possible. What I mean that is we want to avoid as many shadows and inconsistencies in the light as possible. If we only have one light lighting up the background, this side will be bright, but then that side will be dark. And that's going to give an inconsistent key when we are trying to remove the green later in post-production. So we want to make sure we have 2 lights at minimum pointing at the background to be able to give as even as a light as possible. Ideally, you'll have the same light, same size, but if you don't, it can still work, as I have a giant, ridiculous dome and a small little panel light over here, and it's working just fine. Or at least we'll see if it does. So when filming, a lot of times we're told our shutter speed should be double our frame rate. So if we're filming at 24, our shutter speed should be 48. If we're filming at 30, it should be 60. But if you are filming in front of a green screen, you want to try to avoid that motion blur. And the reason why is you're going to get a lot more green around your hand. It's going to be a lot harder for the computer to be able to remove and pull that green out. So you want to try to boost your shutter speed high enough so that way then you could get a clean enough key and then add in some motion blur later in post-production. And another great tip when filming with a green screen is you want to try to have yourself as far from the background as possible. I know I talk about this a lot in videos. Oh, you want to be as far from the background as possible. Oh, to create depth, to separate yourself from the background. But in reality, by having yourself further from the background, you're going to have less of that green spill on you. What is the green spill? So depending on what kind of room you're filming and what lights you have set up, how big your green screen is that light is going to hit the green and it's going to spill onto other objects. Such as if you're filming with a more reflective object, it's going to naturally pick up that green. And so when you're dealing in post-production, it's take a lot longer to kind of work around to avoid removing that. Because if you have green on your shoulders, you can get a lot more of a dirty, ugly look. That's something I did years ago. I filmed a YouTube video and we didn't know anything about it. I had it 20 feet wide, so it was kind of wrapped around us. I don't know why, we were just standing there talking, but a lot of the green spilled on us, and so we had this weird speckle look effect, and it didn't look very clean and good. There's a lot more tools that can help you help with spill suppression, but you want to try to minimize it as best as possible during filming. Now that we're in the editing process, the first thing we want to do is we want to add a crop effect. The reason why I like to do this is that way we can just get as close to the subject as possible so we can avoid any of maybe the shadows that wasn't as even on the outside of the screen, or as you can see in this shot that I have here, is that we can see the clamps, we can see the light on top, and since we don't want those to be in the shot, we want to go ahead and crop that out. So we'll just go ahead and bring our crop tool, do a quick mask, and remove that portion of the background. Perfect. Something I like to do sometimes is to go to the Lumetri Color tab, go to the HSL secondary, grab the color pick tool, get as close to my subject as possible, hold the control key to get as a bigger sample of the green, and then what we can do is we can hit this button right here to then see what is being affected. So everything in the gray is not being affected, but everything that is green, the color we selected, is being affected. So we could see that there's probably a little bit more shadow down here that we want to adjust. Now, even if we had a mask, it's still saying, hey, this part's not being affected, but that's no worries. So we'll go ahead and stretch out our either hue, saturation, or luminance to get the best sample of green that we can. Once we feel like we're satisfied, what we can do is we come on here and we can do a little bit of denoise and blur just to kind of soften it a little bit more, but we don't want to soften it too much because again, we don't want that green to intersect with our subject. So once we're done with that, we'll go ahead down here to our color wheel. We can boost our greens a little bit more, tint the green a little bit more, add a little bit more saturation. That way it's just as even as possible. You'll see this a lot with stock footage clips if you download of like bats or a candy cane. They'll sometimes have that like super green background that's just like obnoxious green, and that's kind of what we're trying to replicate right here. So once we have that, what we'll then do is we'll come to our effects tab, we'll go to the we'll search for ultra key, we'll bring it onto our subject, boom. Like I said, we'll grab that color picker, we're gonna get as close to our subject again, holding the control key, clicking down to it, boom. Looks like a perfect key, but it's just on a black background. So let's go ahead and bring our backdrop on so that way we can get a better idea of how clean it actually is. So we can turn it on and it looks pretty good. I think we're relatively happy with how the key looks, but if we go over to our ultra key effect and on output we click on the click down menu and go to alpha channel, we can then see what is being affected. And so we can see our subject, we want our subject to be as pure white as possible, as that is not being affected by the color key. If we're having splotches of gray or black on our subject, then that old footage that I showed of me at the Oscars would be similar to that effect where it's going to be grainy, it's going to be very noisy, and it's not going to look very clean. So what we can do is we come to our matte generation and we can just kind of play around with our sliders to see what works best and how it affects our green screen. So our shadow's at 50. Once we pull it down, if we pull it down all the way, it gets rid of all that. But now we can see on my watch over here and on myself, then now we're getting a little bit more of that spickle spackle. So if we come back to composite, now we can showcase, oh, that's what we're talking about. That doesn't look too good. So we'll go back to our alpha channel and now boost back up our shadows. But even though we got rid of it on my watch and it looks better, it now is looking a little not as clean right here. So there's still some other tools that we can play with, such as tolerance, and we can just go ahead, like I said, just slide it back and forth to see what works best. So the pedestal seems to have cleaned it up pretty well. That didn't really affect our watch. Now we can come down here to matte cleanup, and there's a few other tools that we can incorporate if we need to. So the choke is going to shrink our subject or tighten up on our edges of our frame. So you can kind of see when we pull it back, it's going to cut back on our subject. Now, we can see that there's these little lines, especially around like my arm hair, that we could see that maybe didn't get as clean as a key. So if we pull back that choke, it's going to remove that, but it's also sometimes can impede on your subject and make edges look jagged and edgy. So we don't want to just pull out to 100, but you can incorporate and play with it a little bit. But if you do have to raise it a little higher, then what we can always do is we can go to the next tab, which is soften, and it's just going to soften that shadow a little bit. But as you can see a little bit when I pull it so much, my ears look a little funky. So it's a matter of just playing with it to what looks the most natural to you. And then we can play with any of these other tabs, like I said, just to kind of see what works best, the contrast, the midpoint, and clean it up as best we can. Then there's going to be spill suppression, which is already have an effect lifted on it. As we can see, if we pull it down to 0, it has done its job where we've got a little bit of green on my arm that we can see that I was talking about. As the closer you are to the green screen, it's going to naturally bounce the color. We see a little bit that's in my hair, but we can see that spill suppression took it out, and it was already set up, took it out pretty clean. So now once we have our subject in the scene, we're essentially done. But what you want to do is you always want to try to match your subject and your background as much as possible. So when you're filming a green screen, you don't want to just go, oh, we'll just figure out a background later in post, because if you're grabbing a pre-existing image or video, then you want to try to match the lighting as best you can to your background. Because if you don't, then you're going to just look like you're in a completely different space and it doesn't look like it matches. Another thing, actually, before we wrap this up, I like to do is I like to come over here and go to the camera lens. Oh, I thought that's what it was called. Let's just search blur. Oh, maybe they got rid of that. Camera blur. It's just camera blur. I think in After Effects it's called the camera lens blur. Is I like to add a camera blur. I add it to my subject. Not meant to do that. And what this is going to do is this is going to simulate that bokeh, that shallow depth of field, that blur that we would get in camera. But obviously we don't want it to be so high up that it looks completely unnatural, but just to kind of play with it just like a % or 2. I actually added 12. So that way it kind of plays a little bit more within the subject. So that's just pretty much the general setup of how do you use a green screen? How do you edit with the green screen? I hope this helps. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. We'll see you next time. Bye.